future. I am going to take just a quick minute to tell you a little bit about what's happening in GLAS before I introduce our beloved speaker. I wanted to encourage folks to take note that on October 18th, we have our next, on November 15th, we have our next colloquium with another one of our new colleagues, Justin Fan, who's presenting on Remembering Otherwise, Afro-Asian Affiliations in Tuan, Andrew Nguyen's The Specter of Ancestors Becoming. So please take note, November 15th at 11. And also we're celebrating in Global Asian Studies that UIC has received a 4th Anna Peasy grant, which is really exciting, and I'll be happy to tell you more about that in the question answer if you want to know more. And there's also some big news, which is our colleague Michael Jin's book just came out, Citizens, Immigrants, and the Stateless. So congrats to Michael Jin. And we have so much more news that you can learn about by following us on Facebook, joining our email list. So please do check out the Global Asian Studies Facebook page and join our email list. It's an extremely lively community here in GLAS with a lot of connections between students, student groups, the cultural centers, and what's happening in Chicago. And so no more further ado, I will introduce our speaker for our colloquium today. And it's such a great honor to be introducing our new colleague, Professor A. Naomi Paik, who's an associate professor in Global Asian Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice, and was also hired in the Diaspora Cluster. Her research and teaching interests include comparative ethnic studies, US imperialism, US militarism, social and cultural approaches to legal studies, transnational and women of color feminisms, carceral spaces, and labor, race, and migration. Dr. Paik will be presenting on her most recent book, Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding US Immigration for the 21st Century, published by University of California Press. And this book examines the long developing criminalization of foreign-born people in the United States and the need for radical abolitionist approaches to sanctuary. And I've personally seen this book really change the world by providing us with a framework for connecting immigration justice struggles and abolitionist struggles through and expanding the framework of abolition for so many of our communities to integrate militarism, border control, detentions, deportations, et cetera, into the way we think about the the violence of carceral systems and also building the future that we want. So thank you for all the work that you've done. She has also published Rightlessness, Testimony, and Redress in US Prison Camps since World War II in 2016, which is a winner of Best Book in History of Asian American Studies Association 2018, many other awards for this incredible book. And she has made brilliant and incredible interventions to many fields and social movements from her work as a board member of the Radical History Review, where she produced 3 special issues, one on policing, one on sanctuary, and one on militarism and capitalism. So I encourage you to check those out. And her many publications in leading journals, and also all she has contributed with her recent position as a fellow with IPRH Mellon in Legal Humanities on abolition at UIUC, and also her many op-eds and interviews and podcasts. And I'm just going to put a couple of these pieces from her public work in the chat for us in a moment so you can check them out, and also put her website so you can learn about her work if you wanted to learn more. So really this is all in the name of welcoming our new colleague to UIC and to let you know how excited we are that you're here. And she has received many honors and awards beyond the book. Book award I mentioned, Helen Corley Petit Scholar Recognition as Extraordinary Early Career Faculty at UIUC is just one of them. So with that, let's just take a moment to welcome Professor Paik to UIC, to GLAS, to CLJ, and to let you know how extremely privileged we feel to have you with us here. So the floor is now yours. I want to thank Glenda as well for helping put the colloquium together.
All right, thank you so much for that really warm introduction, Nadine. And it's really nice. I was thinking that not very many people would be able to come just because it came together pretty recently. So I'm really just delighted to see all of you here. And I really do feel very welcome at UIC, and I'm super happy to be here. So I am just, my presentation is going to be somewhat informal. So I'll just talk about the book kind of in broad strokes for a little while, and then I'd just love to be in conversation with you all. Glenda, could you give me share screen privileges or make me the co-host? Oh, there we go. Okay.
You should be okay.
Okay, let me see. Okay, everyone can see this? I feel like I do this every single class and I still am not super great at it. Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you everyone. And I also want to thank all the folks in GLAS, CLJ, and the Diaspora Studies cluster for actually pulling all the strings together to get me to come to UIC. I'm really delighted to be here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book. So I just wrote this book, Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, and what the impetus behind the book was the 2016 election. So like a lot of people, I wasn't necessarily surprised, but it still felt like a shock, and I was really horrified that so many ordinary people across the nation would send 45 to the highest and most powerful political office in the nation and maybe even the world. And I was really terrified about what this meant for so many people, especially a lot of the students that I was working with at UIUC. A lot of them I knew were either undocumented or documented, or were from the kinds of backgrounds that I knew Trump was going to come for them. And so like a lot of other people, we started preparing for what was coming. And basically some colleagues and I started working on putting together the sanctuary campus resolutions to bring to the administration. I'm sure, as all of you know, because you guys did the same thing, that the president of the whole system wrote this really terrible response, and that was basically like, we're never going to do that, and we're scared of losing funding. So we worked together across the campuses and wrote another one, and then he moderated his response a little bit, but still has not declared the University of Illinois a sanctuary campus. So that's kind of where some of this started generating. And, within days of taking office, 45 confirmed our worst fears. And so in January 2017, he authorized 3 executive orders that are kind of the grounding for the first 3 chapters. So the Muslim ban, the border wall, and ICE raids. And he passed these executive orders along with a slew of others that were targeting a range of ordinary people and the planet. So things around the pipelines, things around policing, et cetera. And so what I argue is that these executive orders define our current approach towards non-citizens and foreign-born peoples through bans, walls, and raids. But at the same time, this is, of course, not the whole story. These executive orders, as well as his ascendance as president, ignited a lot of resistance movements, including these airport protests, where thousands of people gathered to protest the Muslim ban, shouting slogans like "No ban, no wall, sanctuary for all." And I don't know if you guys remember, but it was a bitterly cold night at O'Hare, and yet we were all out there for hours. So as part of this kind of gathering storm of resistance, we've also seen the proliferation of sanctuary as a concept and as a movement. So it spread through hundreds of churches and then went to new kinds of sites like other religious congregations, cities, campuses, mass transit systems, even restaurants and homes. And so this mass resistance and refusal basically signified our refusal to let the federal government violate and abuse its powers against our neighbors. And so what the book does is look at the long history that has led us to this perilous moment, as well as the resistance movements that are already in motion to defend each other and to create the transformed world that so many of us want. And so the first 3 chapters offer a deep history of the three signature anti-immigrant executive orders. So the Muslim ban, the border wall, and ICE raids. And so what I'm saying is that none of these things are new, but have historical roots that go all the way back to the very foundation, settler colonial foundations of the United States, as well as the 19th century birth of immigration restrictions. And I also discuss how the criminalization of foreign-born people really ramps up and picks up speed in the era of neoliberalism. And so a lot of the book kind of focuses on neoliberalism as a framework through which to understand these converging targeting. And then I look to, in the last chapter, in the epilogue, I look to sanctuary as that capacious concept, a deep genealogy, and a recurrent social movement that can inform our response to the question, what is to be done? And so in those last 2 sections, I propose an abolitionist approach to sanctuary as one way of struggling against these entangled oppressions that have led us to this current crisis. Okay. All right. So I start each chapter with one of the executive orders and then trace it back to 2 foundational moments. So one is the settler colonial foundations of the United States. And so as we know, the US is built on the colonization of land seized from its original peoples and driven by the logic of destroying the civilizations and peoples already here in order to replace them with a new, permanent, and racially exclusive society. And in the United States, that racially exclusive society is, of course, based on whiteness, which we can see in the Constitution itself, as well as the 1790 Naturalization Act, which restricted citizenship to only free white persons, right? And I'm happy to go more into how I use settler colonialism, riffing off of Kelly Lytle Hernandez's brilliant book, City of Inmates. The second foundational moment I go to is Chinese exclusion. And I go to Chinese exclusion because it is the origin of federal immigration restrictions. And from the very beginning, those restrictions on migration were rooted in racism, patriarchy, and capitalist labor exploitation. And so our first federal immigration laws, like the Page Law Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, targeted Chinese women for being lewd and immoral people who were always already going to be sex workers, as well as Chinese workers. So these original bans wove together gender, race, and class-based restrictions into this original ban. And once the federal government starts restricting and excluding people, it really gets on a roll. So within months of passing the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, it then goes on to pass other acts that restrict people who are likely to become a public charge, people who are disabled, people who are have criminal backgrounds, et cetera. And this culminates in 1924. In 1924, we created the US Border Patrol and passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which was the first globally comprehensive restriction system. And it was the legislative achievement of the eugenics movement. And it was basically a way to racially engineer a white population in the United States. And when signing the act, President Calvin Coolidge said that he had to sign the act so that America should remain American. And congressional debates show that this bill was deeply rooted in anti-Catholicism, but especially anti-Semitism. So this proxy for global region as a proxy for religious discrimination and religious restrictions also has very deep roots. It didn't start with the Muslim ban, right? And the Johnson-Reed Act was an inspiration for Hitler as a common sense policy to achieve racial purity. So he looked to our immigration policy as he was envisioning his ideal German society. Right. So the so-called tribal 20s, when the Border Patrol starts and when the Johnson-Reed Act is passed, it's basically, this is the period that 45 and his minions want to return us to, as we can see in this quote by Jeff Sessions. And what he's doing here is he's criticizing the 1965 Hart-Celler Act that did away with national origin restrictions and brought us formalized equality in the immigration system. And what he's saying is that by opening up the gates, which there's a criticism around that as well, but by opening up the gates to people of formerly decolonizing nations, that that we are not able to assimilate, and that we have brought the decline of the middle class in the United States. And it's really in this is also the very beginning of the era of neoliberalism that has defined our approach, or that is the context for our approach to migration restriction over the last 40 to 50 years. And so the book kind of picks up speed once we get to the 1970s or 60s and 70s. And I start talking about a lot of laws and policies passed from Reagan to Obama, marking several key turning points. So this is kind of just a very quick summary. I go into more depth through each of these, and I show how the criminalization and targeting of not foreign-born peoples has been a completely bipartisan issue, and that it's a way for people on both sides of the aisle to score cheap political points by destroying people's lives. So I trace some of these policies, including the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is a cautionary tale for us now as we're pushing for a path to citizenship for those who are undocumented. Because even as we provided that path before for 3 million in 1986, it also came with massive investments into INS enforcement, especially the Border Patrol. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing this escalation of violence at the border. In 1996, Clinton, who is one of my least favorite people of all time, pushed a massive criminalization wave against both citizens and non-citizens of color. He also destroyed the social safety net through pre-WARA, and he passed two really terrible anti-immigrant bills, the ERA, or the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, as well as EDPA, which was an anti-terrorism act. After 9/11, of course, we have the fusing of national security to immigration control, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and CBP. And the significance of DHS and ICE and CBP cannot really be overstated, right? And then under Obama, we have kind of a nice veneer lightly papering over the fact that he is in fact the deporter in chief. And by splitting off felons from families, as if felons do not have families, he was trying to divide off good immigrants from the ostensibly bad immigrants who deserve to be criminalized and kicked out of the country. So the whole point of going through all of this history in each chapter is to show that Trump has a really robust foundation to build on. So we've already been living with aggressive policing, hundreds of miles of border fencing, ICE raids, anti-Muslim racism, mass trials, and the separation of children from their families for decades, right? So the problem, this is the argument of the whole book, I hope you'll still read it, is that the problem is not Donald Trump. It's never been Donald Trump. The problem is the United States of America. And so while the first 3 chapters show us how we got here, the last chapter and epilogue talk about what can we do. And so if all of these different oppressions work together, so it's not just about targeting foreign-born people, but also about race, gender, ability, relationships to capitalism, property ownership, et cetera, then what is our approach? And I am saying that an abolitionist approach to sanctuary might help us defend communities right now and also envision and build the future that we deserve. So the key intervention is kind of putting sanctuary and abolition together. And these are 2 concepts that might seem not to go together at first, but I'm arguing that we can think of them in the same framework and what is enabled by doing so. So an abolitionist approach to sanctuary works on multiple simultaneous fronts of struggle and grasps things at the root, riffing off of Angela Davis, rather than trimming branches only to watch them grow back stronger. So going back to the IRCA would be a really good example of trimming off a branch only to see it grow back stronger. And so I look to sanctuary because it has a millennia old history and a moral and philosophical tradition that have the power to contest state violence. So it's found across different spiritual traditions, but what is consistent is this demand that we treat the stranger with hospitality as if they were our own neighbor. And in medieval times, for example, sanctuary churches would grant mercy and protection to individuals fleeing harsh punishments, welcoming anyone under duress, even people who had committed serious offenses like murder. And so one of the key concepts of sanctuary is welcome without condition, which is fundamentally different from what we're seeing in a lot of sanctuary city policies, which continue to criminalize certain kinds of immigrants, like those labeled as gang members, while sheltering others. And I'm saying that that is a non-starter. It will never be effective, and it will never actually protect even the good immigrants as long as you're casting out others. And so over the millennia, people have refused to cooperate with unjust law and have provided sanctuary to others precisely because they knew justice would not be delivered. So abolition demands the dismantling of structures of state violence, and more important, it's about building up the world we want in its place, a place where bans, walls, and raids are no longer needed. Right. So one example is that calls to defund the police. Yes, they are about dismantling and disempowering the police, but they are more importantly about taking those funds and investing them in institutions and resources that actually create community well-being and safety. So things like public education, public health, community gardens, and so on, life affirming institutions. So I'm arguing that an abolitionist sanctuary would connect sanctuary's radical welcome and its judgment-free embrace of anyone to abolition, that social justice organizing that seeks to tear down oppressive power structures like prison systems and build a just, equitable world in their place. And what these movements share is a commitment to taking care of each other. So like sanctuary, which demands that we take in all of our neighbors, abolition seeks to create a society where no one, regardless of citizenship status, criminal record, poverty, ability, or any other factor, is discarded as if they are unworthy of economic means, affirming social relationships, or political power. And so at the very end of the book, I close with this example, which is like, I find deeply moving and very inspiring. And I think that this example shows us how we can defend communities right now under duress, and also encourage us to think about reimagining our relationships to each other now and for the future beyond the terms that are dictated to us by the state. And so in this image, you see Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie showing up to a welcoming ceremony hosted by the Tongva Nation and other Native peoples at LAX. And this is part of the Muslim ban protests. And so as Nick Estes of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe notes, welcoming refugees and Muslim migrants not only recognize their humanity in distinction to the United States, but it also contested the US settler state altogether, which does not have the final say on who or what comes into the country, or exclusive ownership over who and what counts as human. So these indigenous organizers insisted that the United States is not the original or indeed the rightful sovereign of this land. And so acknowledging that the US exists on territory seized through settler colonialism raises the question of, quote, whether I get to claim this land as my own, and whether I have the right to prevent anyone else from settling here as well, as Elizabeth Ellis argues. And so the right to exclude others cannot even be granted to those living on occupied territory. There can be no ban on stolen land. And so performing the welcoming ceremony as this land's original inhabitants worked, in Estes's words, to reclaim our sovereignty, our citizenship, and most importantly, our kinship. And so multiple indigenous nations offer us alternative models of relationality that conceive of belonging and affiliation with each other through reciprocal obligations among humans and resources. So this approach to sanctuary has the potential to reconceive of membership and affiliation beyond the legal status provided by the state. It communicates to the excluded, the undocumented, criminalized, convicted, and outcast that legal status means nothing. The only thing that matters is that you are here with us, which means we are accountable to each other. So the solidarity organizing that drives sanctuary is about defending each other, but it is also about defending the very grounds of our relationships to each other, of the ability to defend each other in the first place. And so as the abolitionist organization Mi Gente declares, the only community of sanctuary is an organized one. So that's it. All right, let me see, stop sharing. Okay, okay. All right. So that is a summary of the book, but I'm really more interested in hearing from you guys. I do want to show you one more thing before. So I hope you can see this. So I had a graduate student, I could not do this on my own, but I had a graduate student help me create a resource guide for the book. And so if you don't have time to read the whole book, but you are interested in teaching it, I have like discussion questions here so to guide you through that. And then I also put together, well, I didn't do this, but my RA put together this really cool timeline. I'm not sure why my computer is being so slow, but it's an interactive timeline. So since the book has a kind of recursive structure, it goes back to settler colonialism at the first of each of the 3 chapters. It kind of, it outlines, why is this taking so long? Okay, it outlines or it puts together the different events that I talk about and the different laws and policies that get passed in chronological order. And this was, I thought that this would be a good idea, partly because organizers asked me to do something like this because they thought it would help them make sense of how these different things all go together. So yeah, so I hope you might find this this website useful in addition to the book itself. And then there's also under maps, my RA also made a 5-minute video explaining the relationship between free trade agreements, neoliberalism, and the criminalization of migrants by looking at NAFTA. So I will stop sharing again. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Naomi, for an incredible presentation. And especially I felt like you wrapped up conversations that folks have been having since like, you know, way back when, but I can even think of like the 90s. So what is that, like 30 years of, you know, political analysis. And then you brought it together into like one, how all of these intersecting histories kind of consolidated the, you know, the violence, state violence, especially against undocumented people, but then also then you bring it back out to all the other interconnected struggles. So I really appreciated that. The floor is open. I have a question, but I'll wait and see what other questions people have. So this is great also that you gave us so much time for discussion. That's what colloquium should be like. So thanks for that. Does anyone have a question you want to ask? Whether it's clarification, and there's a lot on the table here, right? Not only sanctuary movements, but abolitionist sanctuary as a framework. Seems like there's a lot we can talk about. Who wants to start? Okay, I'll start then. I don't see any hands going yet. So maybe this can get us going. I found it really powerful that you integrated the indigenous struggles into what you talked about. And, you know, when you mentioned Nick Estes and his work. And so I was just thinking if you could expand on, because that conversation seems like it hasn't, at least especially in the Midwest, you know, we don't see it rising to the center of discussions about abolition and also about sanctuary. So could you maybe maybe one part of it could be talking about the sanctuary piece around, how the sanctuary movement relates to Indigenous struggles, or how you see it possibly relating, how we might want to relate it.
No, that's a great question, and it's one that I am continuing to think about. And I think other folks are also engaging more with this question: what does it mean to struggle for migrant justice in the context of settler colonialism? So Mahmood Mamdani and Nandita Sharma have written books about this recently. So it's definitely something that I want to think more deeply about. I think that there's a kind of false opposition that is often made between Indigenous struggles for justice and sovereignty, versus as if it's opposed to struggles for migrant justice. But what I'm trying to think towards is how those, that's one of the lose-lose situations that Lisa Cacho, for example, talks about when we start competing with each other instead of seeing our shared struggles for liberation. And so I think that's why that Tongva Nation welcoming ceremony at LAX is so inspiring for me, because it shows that one way that those of us who are struggling for migrant justice can most advance that goal is by recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, right? And recognizing that Indigenous liberation is going to be central to migrant justice. And so thinking about that on the ground would also be about what does it mean that the US, I mean, there's like a lot of like legal ways that we can think about this, but what does it mean that the concept of plenary power, or the fact that the US executive and legislature have basically unfettered power when it comes to dealing with both immigrants in the United States and also Indigenous people in the United States. And so this kind of like unchecked, unfettered power is deployed against those of us who are in the US, but not of the US. And that applies to both Indigenous people and non-citizens. But I think the other thing that I'm trying to think towards, and this is going towards the next book, is kind of riffing off of Elizabeth Ellis's quote that I talked about, and thinking about opening up our notion of relationality, of course, beyond the state, but also beyond kind of limited notions. So thinking about reciprocity, not only among people, but also among people and resources. And so people and environments, and people and other kinds of species. And so if we look at the genealogy and the etymology of sanctuary, it's not just about people who are under duress, but it's also about other species, and it's also about habitats themselves. So thinking about like the Great Barrier Reef as a marine ecosystem that is protected as a marine life sanctuary, right? But it's one that's becoming increasingly untenable due to climate change. And so I think if we can think about sanctuary as being as radically open as possible, not being confined just to human relationships, but relationships between humans and everything else, I wonder if that's another way of not only connecting migrant justice and Indigenous sovereignty, but also migrant justice, Indigenous sovereignty, and also environmental justice, and seeing how all of these things are connected to each other. And they actually, if they're going to be effective, they cannot be disaggregated from each other.
Thank you so much, Naomi. You gave us so much to think about, and I think you might be thinking about your next project as well, right?
I am. I'm trying to think about the next project, but it's so hard. so I'd love to hear what other people think. And also, if you don't like it, that's also okay. Okay, I'd love to hear why.
Laura, and then Beth.
Hi, Naomi, thanks so much. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to get to know you and your work a little bit. And I have a question, and I think I want to start framing it in terms of who you see as the audience or the public for the book. Because I feel like what you're doing it's very big. There's no question about that. And it's a huge reframing, and I think in some ways a much needed reframing. But I'm wondering if you were seeing it primarily as providing a new narrative in a public facing way for people to see how these parts we've studied separately fit together, or if you also see yourself as making kind of an academic intervention, and how you might talk about that and where it might fit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my mind, as I was thinking about putting this together, and also it just kind of kept snowballing. So basically we put, my colleagues and I at UIUC, we put together the sanctuary campus stuff, and then our letters, and then my friend and I at Notre Dame, we did an emergency session at the ASA, which was just a week later after the election, on how to do a sanctuary campus resolution or protest for sanctuary campus at your campus. And so I think because of those things, people started asking me, like, why should we do this? And why is sanctuary the thing that makes sense? And so then people started asking me to give talks about it. So I had to write the talks. And then that became an article that I wrote sitting at cafes with Nadine. and then it just kept going. And I felt like I wasn't done kind of thinking through the concept. And so it was just kind of a snowball thing. But from the beginning, my audience in my own head was my students. And trying to think about, a lot of them are student organizers and are thinking along these kinds of very expansive ways. And I think they're more nimble than some of my colleagues, honestly. And so I had them in my mind, but I also was thinking about, like, as I was meeting people talking about sanctuary, including faith leaders of congregations who either wanted to become sanctuary churches or congregations, or had already hosted migrants as a sanctuary church. So talking to them and thinking about, okay, what is the history that would be useful for them in their work, or to have conversations with their congregations about why we should or shouldn't do this, etc. And then I was also thinking, so, like, basically kind of folks who don't know that much about immigration justice or immigrant history, but wanted to get in, right? And then another audience was also seasoned organizers who are very invested in migrant justice and know a lot of the more recent stuff, especially from like IRA, like basically 1996 to the present, but maybe don't have as much of a sense of like where it all started. And so I had multiple audiences in mind, but I was really thinking like the first audience that was in my mind was my students. And so that's the kind of voice that I end up writing it in as well. And there's also no way, so I wrote the first draft in, I think 11 or 12 months. So there's no way I could have done that unless I had been teaching this material for many years. And so like, and you know, I've gotten better at it because I was not so good at it before, but like, for example, explaining what neoliberalism is and how that relates to global migration, that took me like many iterations in the classroom with different sets of students. And so I think having students who are, you know, like kind of, you know, pushing back and being like, I still don't understand what you're trying to say, that was really helpful for me in terms of writing the book. And I think writing the book in turn has been really helpful for my teaching as well. But I think, so my audience is kind of broad in that way, trying to think about a public audience. And at the same time, it is published by a university press. But the book series that it's under they're meant to be very short and accessible books that anyone can pick up, and they're supposed to be very teachable. So I felt like it was the right kind of venue for what I was going for.
Thanks so much. I hope it reaches a lot of people.
Well, thank you.
Beth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nadine. Naomi, we're so glad that you're at UIC. Every time I hear you talk, I feel inspired both because of your work, but also the way you do your work is such an example, I think, of what we're trying to do here. And I think in particular, sort of showing and talking about and really living the relationship between, you know, writing a book, being an organizer, trying to teach, like all of those things that feel like sometimes they're three separate jobs, but you seem to like be able to do them all at the same time. So I want to acknowledge and appreciate that. And in particular, that last thing you showed us, the website that shows just so much about how other people can use your work in such an accessible way. So thank you for that. And when you were talking, and I think, sort of riffing off a little bit from both Nadine and Laura's question, I was thinking about how reframing has been so much about what we've been trying to do for the last couple of years in particular. And I appreciate so much the focus on the relationship between abolition and sanctuary, and how, we want people to be able to say what they're doing in a way that makes sense for the organizing they're doing, that doesn't contradict other work that's happening, right? And that often people feel like they're only doing one thing and no one else is doing anything that's important or that matters. And I wonder if you're able to kind of bring in a little bit of the discussion around reparations into a kind of reframing. And I ask because I think that's a space in some ways where people are, again, trying to say what we have to have is reparations, what we have to have is abolition, what we have to have is sanctuary, like as if we can't have all of those things. And that the reparations discussion starts to kind of challenge or maybe even contradict some of the other sort of justice movements, because it's about whose space this is, who can make the biggest claims, both material claims as well as political claims about what was taken from us. That sort of oppression of what's lost as opposed to what's possible. I wonder if you can just speculate a little bit how reparations might fit into this kind of reframing, if at all.
Wow, that's a great question. So I guess I have a couple of initial thoughts about that. So one is that I think there are multiple approaches to the question of reparations, and not all of them are conducive to solidarity politics. And so in many ways, they reproduce the very logic that you're talking about, was like, who has the best claim? And I think this actually riffs off of some of the stuff that I talked about in the first book, where I do talk about reparations for Japanese Americans detained under World War II, right? And it does go through this very restricted legal process, and it's about finding only people who were actually in the camps and are still alive today, and also were either US permanent residents or US citizens. Therefore, all of these other people do not get any claim, even though they were also detained unjustly based on racism. So I think that I have like a really sharp critique of that kind of framework. And I think that's part of the problem of going to the state, the very state that set up these systems, whether it's internment or racialized chattel slavery, for reparations itself. And I think that there's something kind of, it will always be put through this kind of narrowed down funnel of what is possible through the state that kind of limits our vision of what is possible, just as you mentioned. Like, instead of thinking about what's possible, we start thinking about what was lost, and then enumerate those claims so that they can be adequately recompensed. And I think that's a very limited way of thinking about reparations. But I think there are also more expansive ways of thinking about reparations, not only for people who are affected by chattel slavery, but also thinking about reparations really broadly. And so thinking about, there's some folks who are in migration studies who are thinking about migration itself as a form of reparations for colonialism, right? Why shouldn't we have the right and ability to move across borders to colonizing nations when you've already extracted all means of living from where we are from? Right. And so I think there's kind of more expansive ways of thinking about it, but also thinking about reparations in terms of what corporations owe us in terms of the damage that they have wrought to environments everywhere. Right. And so I think there's, I guess I'm of two minds of reparations. And so I would not be so supportive of the kind of narrowing kind of model, and the one whose main addressee is the state, or is the entity that led to the deprivation or the violence in the first place. Because I feel like that's always going to be a truncated process that will lead to inadequate outcomes if you're even able to get them at all. I also think that specifically thinking about reparations for chattel slavery, I think we need to think about this not only as in terms of the direct descendants of, but thinking about how slavery was the entire organization of the political economy, not only of the US, but also of the world. And then also how it basically set up our political structures in very particular ways that continue to disenfranchise millions of people. And so if we think about reparations more expansively, not just thinking about who is the victim or the survivor, but thinking about how it structured everything in these violent ways, then you open up reparations in a much more capacious way. That is not just about the direct descendants, but it is about reorganizing society entirely. Because, you know, even the fact that we have an electoral college in the Senate is based in racial slavery. So if we're going to talk about reparations, then we have to talk about reorganizing our political system in a way that would ensure actual democracy and not the fiction of it that we're living under today. And so I think that is a way of reframing things instead of thinking about what was lost and must be recompensed, into thinking about what is possible if we really take, if we make reparations as open and capacious as possible. But that was a great question. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Well, what about, this is, I hope you don't mind this question. It's not directly related to your talk. I'm just giving folks time to raise their hands. We have a lot of issues on the table. Let me just so I'm encouraging folks to share your thoughts. You're welcome to share reflections maybe on, since what we're doing now is we're creating a discussion. It's not necessarily like a formal question answer. So really the floor is open to you. You're also welcome to say a reflection back to the group on what Naomi's talk led you to think about that you hadn't thought about before. That might be a reflection that could be useful to get us connecting with each other around these issues. So does anyone want to share reflections on what Naomi's presentation led us to think about that you might not have thought about before? And I'll say another one that you might think about, which could be if you were to take your own work and your own scholarship or your activism or both, how does thinking through Naomi's book framework lead you to perhaps rethink what you work on? So how would you rethink what you work on through the framework of Abolitionist Sanctuary? So we'll start from Claire, with Claire. And Claire is also one of our new faculty. Welcome, Claire, to UIC.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was trying to do the raise hand button, but
oh yeah, clapping and
clapping, but it's both. And Naomi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I guess I was trying to think of like a question, so I'll try to do, I guess I have two comments, one of which is a question. And kind of building on Nadine's comment about reflections, what I was so struck by in this long history that you trace is how, attention to this longer history of sanctuaries and abolition really maps onto also a trajectory of surveillance technologies, how they've evolved as tools of control over time. And especially the way you did it in showing kind of the shift from eugenics and how eugenics policies get translated into immigration quotas. But in, the more recent ages, the carceral technologies of surveillance that are seen through things like algorithmic surveillance and things like that. One question I had was sort of how you saw your work kind of intervening in discussions that many scholars might have regarding the place or role of how to overcome the obstacles raised by these kind of newly designed black boxes that are emerging. That's one question I would have. And then a second one that came to mind, this is actually building off of the previous comments that have been raised about a lot of this work has been around reframing. And I was actually curious to hear you reflect on, I can imagine there are different kind of trajectories or approaches that instead of trying to reframe would approach it from a radical rejection and kind of adopting new terminology. And so I was curious as to what your response to that approach was, and why the reframing is so important. This is just to learn more.
Yeah, that's great. So in terms of surveillance studies, so this is a really huge problem that a lot of folks are working on. Like James Kilgore runs a whole electronic monitoring kind of listserv and like does a lot of interventions there. And it is something that absolutely I think we're transitioning from kind of neoliberal carceral state into something else, right? And I think right now what we're seeing is the overlay of a mass surveillance society on top of a mass incarceration society. And this both expands the net that the carceral state can cast out, right? And it also threatens like the very foundations of our democracy, right? And so having said all that, I don't really understand how surveillance works, like in the nitty gritty and on the ground, how it works. And I think this is actually a problem. It's an intellectual problem for me, but I think it's also a problem in terms of not only the academic work, but also the organizing work, because how do you mobilize against something that is by design so diffuse and not meant to be seen, right? And so I think folks like Daniel Gonzalez, who's a graduate student at UIUC in geography, is writing a really excellent dissertation on this very subject and thinking about the border and border enforcement as algorithms and as surveillance, right? And so I think those are the kinds of works that we need more of. And I feel like I also need the skill up in how actual, Sengi, yeah, okay, great. Sangi is also working on the same issue here at UIC, so I should put them in touch. But yeah, I think this is something that I need to skill up in. I think you were going to make a comment though. I'd love to hear what you were going to say.
Oh yeah, no, actually, I was thinking of the neoliberal kind of strand of thought, and what your work actually made me realize is how useful it is for kind of mapping out the complexities of the relations of where surveillance technologies are stemming from and who's adopting them, who's using them or repurposing them. And I'm particularly thinking not necessarily in the context of algorithms, but more broadly in the domain of biometrics. And so where you have these privatized institutions, but also government, federal, I don't know, I just think the abolition and you're making me realize the abolition sanctuary approach is actually really useful for getting at that in a way that, at least coming from the tradition of science and technology studies, I don't think they have really grappled with how to illuminate the kind of complexities of that relation. So it'd be something we can talk more about later. This is great.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about how it actually works. So I should definitely talk to you more. So, but yeah, I think the use of biometric information, both like scanning actual migrants who are caught by CBP and things like this, but also like the actual technologies that are being massively invested in and deployed at places like the border, but also like in terms of labor regulation, like on farms and things like that, like smart farms, right? As a way of not only thinking about agricultural production, but also thinking about labor control, right? And how that works in line with the kind of expansive surveillance apparatus that ICE and CBP both have. And what is the integration between these smart farms and like ICE and CBP? Like, I don't really understand it, but I know that there's something happening there, right? And then also thinking about like these technologies that that are being deployed at the border that ostensibly claim that they can look inside a car and determine like who might like do facial recognition inside the car, or how to distinguish between a moving animal at night and a moving human at night, all of these kinds of things. And it's like thinking about what that portends for not only like humans trying to cross the border, but also thinking about the border space itself as an environment and what that kind of surveillance technology can do to that. In terms of your second question, I think Yeah, so I've been thinking about this too, about radical rejection, and I'm not quite sure. I'm really inspired by people like Gilberto Rosas and indigenous scholars like Ben Clouthard, who talk about kind of refusal, right? As refusal as the most principled stand against state violence. And I think part of me is totally on board with that. And part of me is like, does that, like, I think we need all the tools that we have to deploy against, like, in order to move forward in the struggle. And sometimes that means like absolute refusal might not be getting us closer to what we want if we have multiple fronts. But I think for other fronts that that radical refusal is absolutely necessary. So I feel like it just depends on the context, and it depends what the goal is of that struggle. And it's also important to, and I think this is what's hard. It's like, and I think this comes up from the reparations question as well, but it's thinking about how to do these struggles simultaneously and linked up to each other in ways that don't actually self-defeat each other. Okay. So.
Okay, I see Mary Ann's hand.
Hello. Thanks, Nadine. Thanks, Naomi. This was fascinating. I really just had a quick thought on the tech piece of it, which is I did an interview with Cory Doctorow, who has done a lot of, he was the editor of Boing Boing. He's done a lot of work on the ground with freedom struggles in Egypt, and specifically with sort of equipping revolutionaries with tech to counter state tech. And so I'm thinking I might drop you a note with a link to some of his stuff, and I can facilitate an introduction if it seems like your work has overlapping interests. And I know him through his science fiction writing, but he also does a lot of freedom censorship. He did a talk with Ada Palmer down at U Chicago on censorship that I thought was really interesting. So yeah, that's I don't have a lot to contribute. I thought this was super cool, and yeah, I am also still kind of framing the question of rejection versus engagement, and I think it's a hard one, like in terms of not wanting to compromise. Anyway, sorry, my thoughts are a little incoherent, so I'll pass it back.
No, thanks. I would love to be connected and to learn more about the issues that you were just raising. Yeah.
Naomi, one thing that is interesting is how during the Trump era, there was so many mobilizations around, especially around immigration, and those tend to have lost visibility, like in the public eye, like the mainstream corporate media public eye, at least. So could you talk about, you did that in your talk, like the continued urgency of this work, but could you comment on that just a bit more as someone who wrote this book? And I know you know more than ever, more than anyone, or more than many people, how these issues are taking shape under, this so-called like Democratic Party, et cetera. And yeah, and just thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, oh God. So a lot of us have been thinking about this very question, and it's really, God, it's really hard. So, I think the first thing is, it's not like we've never seen this before. We constantly see this. We saw this with Clinton, we saw this with Obama, so basically promising lots of changes, promising progress, and then doing nothing or making things worse, which is what Clinton's whole thing was, right? So, this is kind of the changing same a little bit. And then, it's important to keep in mind that Biden hasn't really done anything. And he hasn't dismantled the worst policies. The camps are still up. Title 42 is still up. We're still separating families. ICE's budget is bigger than ever. He supports that. He's also pouring more money into CBP. So I think we need to, and yet I do think there's something demobilizing about there being a Democrat in office, which I think is self-defeating a little bit right now. And then also, I think that there's also just, in order to get that $3.5 million budget reconciliation bill and to get the infrastructure bill, I think that's where a lot of the mobilization is pushing behind right now. And that means that the illegal deportations of like thousands of Haitians from the US-Mexico border is just kind of a non-issue unless you're already in kind of migrant mobilizations. So, and then I also think that a lot of people are tired from the last several years, and then also being in a pandemic and just living under kind of collective trauma. So I think there's a lot of different things going on at the same time. I also think that we are in the eye of a hurricane, and the back end of that hurricane is going to be much worse than what we saw on the front end. And so we have a very tight window to get anything done, even just to get back to the terrible place we were 5 years ago is going to take a lot. But if we don't do that, then what do you think is coming next? They're just going to build more bricks on the foundation that they've already been building for decades and decades and decades. And so, yeah, I'm like, this is not an answer. I'm really not sure. I'm really not sure how to respond, both like on the ground, but also intellectually to what's coming. And so I think I've been in discussions with other, scholarly people and organizing people about this, but I'm really not sure. And I do understand that, like, even some of the big organizations that have been out in front for a long time, like Mi Gente, took a little bit of a break to kind of regather and regroup, and I think that is also necessary. And you might not get this kind of time and that chance to do that kind of reset in the next couple of years. Because I am sure that what's coming next, especially with de-democratization that's happening right now, that it's going to get worse. I don't think Trump is the bottom. It's not, we haven't hit bottom yet. So I think we need to get ready. And I think that if that means that some people need to reset right now, I think that's also understandable. And also not losing sight that we are in a continued crisis and that it is not getting better. It is only getting worse. So, yeah. So that's not very hopeful. I'm sorry. I like to be more hopeful, but when I'm thinking about what's right in front of us, it's a little bit difficult. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I mean, it's, part of it could be about not having hope, but it's also about providing us with your expertise around the material realities of this struggle, right? And so that we're not just thinking that, things are getting better in this linear way. So thank you for that reality check.
I'll be talking about this tomorrow with Baji, with the director of Baji. So I put the flyer in the
Oh, great.
In the chat, but honestly, I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm really not sure because I feel like it's irresponsible to just be like, well, we're screwed. But like, because I don't think that's true either. But I'm not really sure what to say about this question. So I'd love to hear what other people think.
What do people think? Because I can keep asking questions. Mark, go for it.
Thanks, Naomi, for this presentation. It's really great to have you as a colleague in GLAS and at UIC. What you were just talking about in the conversation for the last few minutes has kind of made me think about, the current Democratic administration. I mean, I know your book was focused on the previous administration, but really one of the striking sort of paradoxes, or I'm not sure it's a paradox exactly, but one of the striking characteristics of sort of the Biden policy agenda, right, is on the one hand, a kind of attempt to revive a kind of New Deal welfare state politics, except enormously expanded. But then on the other hand, as you were just pointing out, this kind of reduplication of the previous administration's policies towards migration, towards border enforcement, the expansion of ICE. And I'm just trying to think about how those two things go together, because, maybe one way to make sense of it is that, in order to sort of legitimate this kind of expansion of government services, you have to sort of reinforce or reassure people that they will only go to legitimate Americans, right? And so there's this way in which this whole question of national identity gets re-intensified. And of course, we are in a period where nationalism is resurging in all kinds of places around the globe. I'm not sure, this is part of the question. And you were saying before something about sort of the transitional nature of this moment. And I think that's really kind of getting at this, that, we see this in the Biden administration, this weird hanging on to these sort of really regressive and vicious policies of the past at the same time as there's this attempt to kind of, expand the welfare state. And that's, and that makes me think about the New Deal, right? Sort of at least one of the original templates of this model, where on the one hand, you do have this massive expansion of social services, but it goes along with incredible racial segregation and exploitation. And so I'm just wondering how, we can kind of start to make sense of this in this moment without sort of, getting too mired in kind of the American past. And I think this is kind of some of the directions that you're helping to point us into. So if you have any thoughts about that, I'd be really interested in hearing them.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I guess just the first thing, which is just kind of like the easy thing, is that Democrats are not our friends, and they have not been for a very, 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 very long time. In fact, I love beating up on Clinton because he just is so horrible. But in the book, I talk about how Rahm Emanuel, as the kind of Democrat DNC strategist, wrote this policy document basically laying out Democratic strategy that would lead the Democratic Party for the next several decades. And if you read the policy document, it is basically Trump's wish list, right? So it's decimating welfare. His whole, prohibiting all naturalizations, suspending naturalizations until we get it in order, right? So like people literally can't naturalize. Okay, this is a Rahm Emanuel proposal, deporting all deportable immigrants, right? So like this has been the Democratic platform for decades. And his logic was, when we move to the right, when we take Republican positions, they'll have nowhere to go, which is the dumbest strategy I've ever heard of in my entire life, but also just goes to show that the Democrats have never been on our side, so we should put zero faith in them ever, right? Including right now. The other thing that you're talking about is like, how do we think of the kind of New Deal-esque kind of reinvestment or renewed interest in taking a social safety net? How do we put that together with the mass expulsion of immigrants and continued criminalization? I actually think they work very well together. And it's precisely because of the reason that you laid out. It's that the welfare state goes towards those who are legitimate recipients of these benefits, right? And non-citizens will always be cast out from that kind of framework. So it actually goes, I think they actually work together. And I think your referencing of the original New Deal is also very apt, because that whole massive expansion was based on excluding agricultural laborers and domestic laborers from any kind of labor law, partly because those were the forms of employment that were mostly performed by Black people. Those kinds of employment are now mostly fulfilled by migrants of color, right, or non-citizens of color. And then also thinking about racial segregation. So thinking about New Deal housing policies and redlining and things like this. And so I think that, again, on the one hand, of course, I want people to have subsidized childcare. I want people to be able to go to college without having to take out massive amounts of debt. Like I want all of the things that are in the infrastructure and reconciliation bills. And also it doesn't, that does not mean that the people who are fighting for those things are necessarily on the sides of people who are not citizens either. You know, so I think both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think this is why we need like a kind of multi-sided strategy and also multiple fronts of struggle. And so one of the things that I've been struggling with in terms of the immigration kind of components of the reconciliation bill are, one, what are they talking about when they're talking about citizenship for all? They are talking about citizenship for any undocumented person in the United States, which I completely stand behind. And also that excludes many of the people who are trying to enter the country and who are being held in camps. So it's not really all, it's a truncated all, it's something else. And then the other thing is that even the citizenship for all kind of component of the bill, as Baji has pointed out, is actually is not as inclusive as it seems. And it actually reinforces certain lines of criminalization of certain kinds of migrants, especially Black migrants. And so how do we keep all of these things together? And also some of the folks who are really for citizenship for all and feel very threatened by the fact that the Senate parliamentarian is basically saying we have to take this out, they're ready to scuttle the whole thing. The whole reconciliation bill of citizenship for all is not included. And so there's a lot of different competing things going on at the same time. And it's like, this is when rubber hits the road in terms of policy. This is the problem with believing that policy is going to save us, because like there will always be negotiations made and the same people who get screwed over every single time will get screwed over again this time. And so, and this is one of the reasons why I think we have to have a much more expansive and capacious, like kind of envisioning of what do we want and how do we get there. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say about that. So yeah.
Let's hear from Jessica. Thank you so much for that, Naomi. I just feel like I got a crash course. All right, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Naomi. This is totally fascinating and I can't wait to read the book. I wanted to kind of circle back to the end of the last chapter on this kind of concept of sanctuary. And you describe it as kind of radical, unconditional kinship, which is obviously a hugely demanding idea. I just wonder if you can say something about how you think we can kind of build a better public imagination about that concept, and also, if this isn't too philosophical, if you think there's a way to secularize that concept and kind of divorce it from a metaphysics, either of a traditional monotheism or an indigenous philosophy. Like, how do we actually make that concept of sanctuary in that radical guise more ubiquitous?
Oh, those are such great questions. So it is a hugely demanding idea to accept everyone without condition. It is very demanding of us. And at the same time, that kind of capaciousness and welcoming the stranger, it doesn't mean we all have to like each other. I think that is unrealistic. So I don't have to like you in order for me to believe that you should have what you need in order to live. You know what I mean? I can think you're a jerk, and that's okay. You know, like we might just not get along, or we might have different kinds of worldviews, but that doesn't mean that I want you to just be discarded and just taken away or deported or put in jail or something like that, right? And so I think it is, there's something about like being in relationship with each other does not mean that we are necessarily in a always positive relationship with each other. I think that is unrealistic and like overly a utopian idea, but we can be in relationship with each other insofar as like, I think you should have everything that you need, that it takes to live well. And that I will do what it takes to create the conditions for you to have what you need to live well. And I think that's different from like being always liking each other, or like, you know, having each other over or something like that. I think it's a different kind of kinship, right? So that's what I would say about that. In terms of building up, is there a way to secularize the concept? I think absolutely. And I think also thinking about sanctuary as being kind of operating, maybe not under that name, but operating as a concept, that as a core concept to many religious traditions and not just Judeo-Christian ones. But you mentioned indigenous ones. In Indigenous America, Aimee Villarreal is actually working on this concept about tracing an indigenous US kind of genealogy of sanctuary and of welcoming others. And I think the book Comanche Nation also talks about how, or Comanche Empire, also talks about how incorporating others into one's nation can actually be a way of expanding collective power rather than limiting or threatening collective power. So I'm interested in kind of thinking about that. Like, how is it that we can build mutual empowerment by bringing more people in rather than building up borders in between us? And so I think that we are already kind of in a move towards secularizing sanctuary. So even thinking about sanctuary cities or sanctuary campuses, those are not necessarily rooted in or connected to any particular religious tradition, but it's about thinking about what are the kinds of statements, policies, things that we can do to create a more welcoming community for everyone. And so I think that kind of secularization is already kind of happening. What is useful to me about the connecting sanctuary, or the genealogy of sanctuary that is rooted in religious traditions, is that I think whenever we're speaking about the divine, like a divine demand that we treat the neighbor treat the stranger as our neighbor, we are talking about things that are beyond human capacity, beyond human imagination. And I feel like the divine kind of speaks as a placeholder for that, for what is beyond what we can imagine right now. And so that I find somewhat useful because I think it helps us kind of de-center humans as the center of everything, that everything has to run through us and that humans have the best ideas at all times, which we don't, right? And so it's another move in terms of thinking really capaciously about sanctuary for all, about having a less anthropocentric kind of worldview and approach to these questions. So, yeah.
That's incredibly powerful, Naomi. Far beyond conventional concepts of solidarity and coalition. Really appreciate what you said. Anyone else? Any questions? Justin.
Hey Naomi, so thanks for this really insightful talk. There's so much that's generated from it that's really inspiring in so many ways for me. I think one of the questions I had for you is, I think a lot when you're thinking about abolitionist sanctuary, I was wondering if you might be open to talking a little bit more about how you think about the military and the military industrial complex and how you're seeing the role of sanctuary and abolition in relation to the US military bases and other ways that there's so many ways of even as we think about these sanctuary cities and all these ROTC programs that are trying to recruit the youth and all this other stuff that's out there. So I'm wondering, especially because so much of the history that you're drawing builds on that, and so many of the communities that are impacted by these histories also have a deep relation to the military. I'm wondering if you might just speak a little bit more on that too, and how you think about it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So abolition and abolitionist sanctuary also has to be anti-imperialist, or else it doesn't work at all, especially if we're talking about migration. The whole point, one of the points of the book is that you cannot borderize your way to a migration policy that's actually going to be effective. That's really stupid, and it's been proven that we can't actually do that for more than 100 years. So why do we keep trying to invest more resources into a failed solution to an identified problem, right? If we want to get real about migration, then we have to address root causes. If we're going to address root causes, then we have to talk about global inequalities in wealth and our foreign policies, right? That deprive certain kinds of decolonizing countries of the resources that they need to meet their people's needs, right? And so addressing the US military in particular, because we're the biggest and baddest of them all, right, is going to be essential to thinking about abolitionist sanctuary. right? And so I think there's other ways domestically to think about this that, and I mean, lots of people talk about this, but that the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex recruit from the same people, the same bodies of people. And we can also think about the origins of neoliberalism through the military industrial complex. So for example, Milton Friedman went after the draft as one of his first things, that one of his first social programs to get rid of, right? Because he was like, we should have an economic draft. And so like social actors who have fewer options will voluntarily go into the military, and the military will not have a problem in terms of recruitment, right? And so like that was one of his initial kinds of big pushes in terms of policy that he was able to get. And it's not like he was anti-imperialist, right? He knew that the military power was going to be needed to secure certain kinds of economic relationships that were going to siphon wealth from certain areas and deposit it elsewhere, right? But I think that thinking about the way the military has evolved under the era of neoliberalism is another way for us to connect justice for people from the areas in the United States that get recruited into the military industrial complex, as well as like the same systems that end up causing the root causes of migration around economic extraction, military violence, et cetera, right? So again, these are two groups that are often seen as in opposition to each other, rightly so many times, right? Because like our military goes to other places and wreaks havoc and causes destruction, and then we create refugees, right? So of course they're going to be seen in opposition to each other, but if we can look at things more structurally, can we see connections that that are affecting both of these populations together? So yeah, I think that for me, it seems really obvious that an abolitionist sanctuary needs to address the military and military industrial complex. And it also needs to think about the false economies that have led to things like military based economies, or to the fact that the military recruits from impoverished people who have been left behind by neoliberal capitalism in order to police and destroy other communities that are also affected by, extracted from by neoliberal capitalism. So yeah.
So abolition necessitates abolishing the military. Let's go. Thanks, Naomi.
Let's go.
Thanks for that question, Justin. I mean, the question was so great because it helped, you know, sort of, in a way, like illustrate your framework and to kind of bring it all together. So thank you so much. Does anyone want to share anything else as we can close out if
Oh,
yeah,
one more thing.
Yeah, go for it. And Justin has more.
Because Justin just put in I haven't been looking at the chat so much, but Justin just put abolishing the military as a form of reparation. I think that actually totally makes sense. Think about, okay, we spent $6.5 trillion on the war on terror thus far. Right? So think about what we could fund if we're talking about the divest invest model, or just dismantling life annihilating institutions in order to build up life affirming institutions. Wouldn't going after military budgets be like an excellent way to do that? You know, in addition to going to PIC and policing budgets, right? We would have trillions of dollars to fund childcare and free college and whatever, right? Medicaid for all. So. Okay, now I'm really done. So.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I feel like I know I'm going to get off this call and start doing more organizing work and coalitional work and academic work, trying to think about these interconnections and how we get there, you know, in the years to come. Thank you. I see some claps, some Zoom claps. We can do virtual claps. Anything. So greatest thank you, Naomi. This was incredibly brilliant. And, you know, I was going to ask, and we're not going to go there now, but, you know, what are we all going to do at UIC now that you're here? Like, you know, let's go. How you know, I look forward to working with you and talking with you about, how we bring your analysis to the work on the ground on campus with our students and all of our communities in Chicago. So thank you all. And again, our next colloquium is with Justin Fan, who's here with us now on November 15th. So I hope to see you all there. You can follow the emails from GLAS or go on the Facebook page for the link to register. That will be at 11 o'clock on November 15th. And thank you again to Glenda and everyone for making this happen. Have a great day, folks. Thank you. Good to see all of you.
Thank you, Nadine and Glenda, for putting this together. And thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you. Thanks.